Welcome back to the Postpartum Plan podcast. This podcast is designed to support and empower you through postpartum. Whether you're expecting, in the early postpartum days, or beyond, this space is for you. I'm your host, Madison Fugere, a dedicated postpartum doula and pediatric sleep consultant, striving to help parents feel confident and supported in their parenting journey. Each week, I'm sharing practical tips and expert advice to help you navigate all the postpartum things with confidence. Well, as much confidence as you can. Let's embark on this journey together, making your parenthood as serene and supportive as possible. Julie Brill is an international board-certified lactation consultant, certified childbirth educator, labor doula, and has been working with families in their childbearing years for over 30 years. She has a busy private practice helping parents to feed their babies virtually and in person in Eastern Massachusetts. She also offers private, independent, and virtual lactation and childbirth classes to pregnant families and virtual CAPA trainings for doulas and childbirth educators. Her popular virtual course, Breastfeeding for Birth Professionals, helps those working with perinatal families to more confidently support lactation. Julie is the author of the doula anthology Round the Circle, Doulas Share Their Experiences book, and the mother of 2 adult daughters. You can get her information in the show notes below to join one of her classes or receive some of her support. So let's dive into it. I am so excited to have you here with me today, Julie. Thank you so much for joining me.
I can't wait. Thank you for having me, Madison.
So exciting. We were just talking about how it's going to be so great to just kind of give people like point one, where do you start? Like understanding just the basics of all of this like breastfeeding world, because it can be really overwhelming. So I'm excited to kind of collaborate and chat about like where do we start and how do people go about all of this new experience?
Yeah.
Yeah. Before we kind of like dive into what to expect and how to prepare and all that jazz, do you want to tell everybody a little bit about yourself and like how you got into the field that you're in now?
Sure. So I'm Julie Brell. I'm an IBCLC, but I'm also a longtime childbirth educator. I'm a labor doula. I also train childbirth educators and labor doulas. I wrote a doula anthology. And I got into it, I think in a way that's a little unusual. I think a lot of people come to it through their own birth experiences or postpartum experiences. And I was already in it before I had my kids. So, when I was still an undergrad at Tufts, I took the Massachusetts Midwifery Alliance course to become a home birth midwife, which was like just an amazing launching pad. It's sort of, I've
Wow.
always known that this was where I wanted to go,
That's
somewhere in
awesome.
this childbearing year. Yeah.
Yeah. That's so cool. I find it so interesting to talk to people that also have like jumped into this world before kids, because that's obviously what I did too, and where I am right now. And so it's been so nice to see like people now down the road who were, starting it before they had kids and like made it through and are now like experiencing, the longevity of the field. So it's always so nice to hear those stories, and like it almost is like even more reassuring because it's like you knew this was where you wanted to be. And that's so cool to have such a strong passion towards something.
Definitely. And yeah, it's been a long time. It's been more than 30 years. So, I'm
That's
hooked.
awesome. That's
Yeah.
awesome. I love that. That's awesome. So like, do you have a favorite part of offerings that you do, since you do a lot of different things? Is lactation support something that's like your number one like favorite thing to do, or do you kind of like the combination of them all?
I love all the pieces. I love following families along. So my favorite thing
Yeah.
is to start to work with them prenatally, do a childbirth class, do a prenatal breastfeeding class, like sort of help them set themselves up for success before the baby's even fully here. And then watch them become parents, like kind of transition to the other side.
Yeah.
That's really fun. And I think
Yeah.
nice for them, like I'm a familiar person from the before times when I
Right.
come and they have their new baby because everything seems, I think, often kind of alien and weird.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I think you just mentioned something that so many people are like, about when it's their first kid, which is like a prenatal breastfeeding course, which I
Right.
think so many people think and they're like, well, what the heck am I doing at a prenatal breastfeeding course? Like, I don't have a baby, I'm not lactating. Like, what's the purpose of going and like learning and seeing these classes and like spending that money if the baby's not here yet and we don't know like how they're going to be feeding and eating? Isn't that a thing you do after? So, like, what would you say to those people? What are we myth-busting on that one?
I mean, that is such a great question. I mean, my wish for everyone is, that they would have an introduction to infant feeding before the baby's here. It's not that it's too late once the baby comes, but there's so much going on emotionally, physically, with the family dynamics, with, sleep deprivation. There's so many different pieces
Absolutely.
going on, that the more you're kind of prepared. The class I do is based on what parents keep telling me they wish someone had told them before they had the baby.
That
You
is
know, like
amazing.
just some of them are like really basic things, but unless you've lived with a newborn, it's not the same to like drop in on your friend for 20 minutes and see the baby while she's sleeping, like
Right.
when you're doing it around the clock, it's just very different.
Absolutely. I had done a previous episode on here about like the boundaries breastfeeding, and what Lo had talked about during that, who's also an IBCLC, was saying that, people don't typically see people nursing, right? And so you're not used to seeing these things. You almost don't know what to expect. And I think that that's very similar to kind of what you're saying here is, people don't know what to expect. So being able to have some sort of like prenatal education as to like what's going to happen can be really helpful to people to physically, but also like mentally prepare for it, right?
Definitely, definitely. And the newborn period, it can be long when you're going through it, but it's short, right? So
Yeah,
people don't necessarily see newborns breastfeeding. Like by the time people are out in the world, often the babies are a little bit older. It's just a
right.
different thing when it's a 2 month old or a 3 month old.
Absolutely. They've gotten into a
Yeah.
groove. They know what they're doing, right?
Yeah, the babies are different. I mean, it's just one of the things I love to tell people is if you can like get on your phone, you f have 5 minutes and watch videos. I mean, hopefully good videos, but
Yep.
videos of people breastfeeding, chest feeding, so you can see what it looks like. That we're supposed to kind of grow up and see those images all the time, just in our natural life, but a lot of modern people don't.
No.
So getting it into your brain in that just very organic way on videos, I think can be really helpful.
Absolutely. It's like a little bit of a research project, right? But it's
Yeah,
good. It's good to know all
yeah.
these things. So, if people are listening prenatally and they're kind of preparing, if they don't have like a class nearby and they're looking up their own videos and they're kind of like teaching, training, preparing themselves, are there things that you typically, besides like if you can get to a class prenatally, obviously do so, or watching these videos, are there things that people can or should do prenatally to prepare for breastfeeding success once baby's here?
Yeah, I mean, so you just did two of them. Take a breastfeeding class, a good breastfeeding class. Watch videos, good videos. Like if you're in YouTube looking for things, like look up, the koala position, look back up laid back breastfeeding. Sometimes it's called biological nurturing. You want to see physiological breastfeeding. You don't want to see the slam and shove, or when my kids were born in the 90s, they called it RAM, like rapid arm movement, people just jamming the baby on the breast. You want to see the baby's really taking the lead. Um, Outside of that, I mean, reading a good book, the La Leche League book is really good. That La Leche League actually has two. One is called Sweet Sleep, that's about infant sleep and breastfeeding, and another one that's called The Womanly Art. It's kind of a dated title, but I guess the next edition is having a more current title, but the information in it is good. Um, that's really helpful. Also, just going to a breastfeeding support group, and seeing people breastfeeding before you even have your baby, if you can, and ask questions or just listen to other people's questions and conversation. I mentioned La Leche League already. They have free groups, but also Breastfeeding USA, same thing, free groups. Finding what's available in your community. Baby Cafe is another one.
Yeah. I think
Yeah.
that's great. And I think one of the big things that you mentioned is like looking up these videos that are like these realistic koala-like or whatever positioning, right? Because I think even when people are going to the hospital, like 9 times out of 10, honestly, I would say 10 times out of 10, but I'm sure there's not. But my clients are often saying to me, "Oh yeah, well I was just taught like cradle hold and I was taught football hold." And like
Right.
not to say that those two aren't bad, but like I'm always telling clients I'm like football's okay, but like the second that they get big enough and those feet can hit whatever's behind you, like they're going to start kicking, which is going to be uncomfortable for you to try to like position. And two, I often find when people are doing that football position that like they end up hunching over more to like get to baby and in turn like they're in pain, right? So I think showing different positioning is so important. And people like, I'm sure know that other positioning's there, but because those are the things that are taught to them from, hour and day one, it's what they assume is the quote unquote easiest or the best, right? And I feel like that's often like false information, right?
I agree, or outdated information. I always think like
Yeah.
that's what I was told with my kids like 27 years ago. Like we do know more now, I mean, like if it's working, it's great. But usually I see people when it's not working, like let's do something that's easier for
Yeah.
parent and baby.
Yeah. So now we kind of assume baby's here. What is breastfeeding 101 like? What are the people supposed to be looking for? Because I find every time I talk to somebody, the lactation consultant at the hospital versus the lactation consultant that they hired through insurance versus the lactation consultant that they hired privately versus what I might have for an education and knowledge. Everything is like great information, but oftentimes like can sometimes contradict one another or is a lot of information. And I tell clients, you're going to get tons of information. I'm going to give you the black and the white. You find your own gray area, right? But like, how do they know what to trust and what they're supposed to be looking for when one, they're hiring maybe an IBCLC, or two, when they're even breastfeeding their baby? What kind of things should we be looking for?
Yeah, I love that question so much on the like black and white and help them find the gray.
Yeah,
I mean, we talk about the sniff test, like it shouldn't smell. Like the advice should make sense. If it doesn't make sense, you don't have to do it.
right,
Part of what's so frustrating in lactation is some of it is, we don't have that much research all the time. A lot of this is more art than science. So
right.
people come at it from different directions. But part of it is that a lot of people are giving out old information or just wrong information. And that's really hard. I actually started teaching a breastfeeding class for professionals. Like, could we all get on the same page? Like,
Yeah,
it's 2024. Could we kind of all talk about the same current stuff because we know it's super
absolutely.
frustrated for parents
It's
when
so
they're
overwhelming trying to
so
figure out what's
overwhelming.
right and what's wrong. Like even for me sometimes as like somebody who has, breastfeeding a class that I had to take and that's part of the donut training, but
Right.
not something I'm not an IBLCLC. I'm not a CLC. I don't have that much background. So even for me, oftentimes my clients will be like, "Oh, my lactation consultant I saw yesterday told me this and this." And I'm like, "Oh, interesting. Like that's new to me." Like,
Does it pass the sniff test, right?
Right.
Like,
And so it makes you wonder. And I'm like, oh, that's great. Like, if you feel comfortable and confident doing that, go for it. But also,
right.
like, this is the information that I want to know, that I know that I want to share with you too. So I love that because I think not only what is it good for professionals to all be on the same page and be sharing proper information, but that means that, these people who are asking for support and looking for support are going to be getting correct support, right?
Right, right. Yeah, I had a client on Sunday and they were in the hospital for 2 days. And one day the LC that came in said, don't pump until the baby's a month old. And the next day the LC said, you can start pumping now. And they were
Yep.
like, we want to do what's the right,
What
how
is
do we
it?
know? Yeah.
Yep, I hear the same thing, the big things with pumping, which I want to definitely touch upon in a moment here, but also like pacifiers, people not
Yeah.
knowing about that. There's this idea of like, okay, when do you supplement, when do you not? And I think those are all things that we can kind of like touch upon a little bit today, but like
Yeah.
there is definitely a lot and I think I love that the sniff test, like really just kind of trust your gut too, right? What do you feel like makes sense to you and what do you feel like is doable for you and your new family is often kind of what I tell people to go with.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, ultimately you're responsible for your baby. Don't do something that doesn't make sense to you, you
I
know?
love that. I love
Yeah.
that. So do you want to kind of like dive into it? So with all of this mix of information people get, right? I think the biggest one that I hear about is the pumping. And I'm so
Yeah.
funny you brought it up. I feel like it's just the podcast is flowing today so seamlessly.
Yeah.
Um, but yeah, when should people be introducing pumping and bottle feeding and things like that? And you know, is there factual information behind or understanding that you might have behind why other lactation consultants or professionals might be giving different timelines and different information?
Yeah, I mean that's a great question. I almost always have questions from clients about pumping, even
Right.
when it's not a pumping consult.
Yeah.
Even if the baby, like this family on Sunday, the baby I think was 3 days old. It doesn't, Americans think about pumping all the time. And partly it's because for the most part we've got really short maternity leaves or,
Absolutely.
family leave. And also people get a free pump from insurance, so it's like you have a toy. Should you use it? Should you try it out? And then the culture of it. So your friends are pumping, if you've been working with somebody who was lactating, they were probably pumping and,
Yep.
like, so we see that a lot, in a way that's not necessarily true in other places. So some of it is a custom fit. Like, do you need to pump? Are you going to be separated from the baby? And if so, do you need the baby to take a bottle? So if the baby's going to daycare, typically they do need to take a bottle. But if they're going to be with grandma, maybe you don't care if they take a bottle. They could take a
Right.
spoon or a cup or a syringe or, something else. So some of it is customizing it in that way. I do think if there aren't extenuating circumstances, there's no reason to figure out the pump right away. There's enough going on.
Right.
So like heal from childbirth and figure out how to be a parent and how to co-parent if that's your situation and understand a little bit about who your baby is and, feed them and try to eat and survive and sleep and all those things are like probably more pressing than pumping unless you have a really short, leave or you have, some appointment you can't bring the baby to on Tuesday, or sometimes people have really extenuating circumstances, or nursing is really hard and you need a break because you have pain from an issue that, you're working with an IBCLC, but it's not
Right.
resolved yet or something. So
Right.
it really depends on what's going on. And so I
Yeah.
think anytime anybody's like, here is the answer, it's not going to be a
It's
one
not.
size fits
No, it's
all.
not. I think that it's so true. Like it's not in one size fits all, but there's so many different things. I think the big times that I see people pumping so early on has to do with, baby maybe being separated from parent, being in the NICU or
Right. We
something.
didn't even say that, but yes,
Right.
separation
And
would be
then
a
the
huge
other
reason.
one that I see a lot of the time is doctors saying, like, oh, baby's underweight, like they need to be supplemented. And if parents give a little bit of pushback, then typically I see PDs saying, okay, well, at least, pump and then offer a bottle or a feed after nursing. So people are triple feeding. They're feeding the baby on the boob, they're pumping, and then they're bottle feeding or
Right.
syringe feeding or whatever. And
Right.
so I find that that happens as well. Often with clients being like, oh, well, my baby's not getting enough, when I often in reality am noticing that it's just due to milk supply not being fully in yet. Um,
Yeah.
but those are typically the times that I see it being initiated so early, or people being like, oh, I really want my partner or my support system to help feed the baby. And in those cases, I am seeing people often pumping earlier. But is there like a negative or a positive effect to waiting or pumping early versus later? Is there something or anything that could really be like affected by that?
So, I mean, it depends on how people are pumping, but typically when people start pumping, they're moving more milk than the baby's going to use right away. And
Okay.
so what you're telling your body is, it's twins, make a lot of milk,
Make
and
more.
so
Yeah.
the body is most sensitive to those messages in the beginning. So if people pump early, they risk creating a situation of overproduction,
Right.
which people with underproduction, that sounds good. But you really want to be in balance with the baby because
Right.
otherwise you wind up being kind of tied to the pump. You have to keep moving that extra milk. And what are you going to do with that extra milk? And it also puts you at risk for plug ducts and mastitis. And, so the goal typically is to be in sync with the baby, and early pumping can interfere with that. Especially like not in the situation you said, like with a NICU baby where you're,
Right.
not there all the time, but where you're also nursing the baby and pumping. That's one issue. Also, we think about nipple confusion, and also we have a better understanding that some of what we used to think was nipple confusion is really flow preference. Like early bottles can interfere with breastfeeding. The topping off that you mentioned can be problematic if people, did the baby get enough? And then they're giving the baby a bottle. The babies can sometimes learn to kind of phone it in at the breast,
Yep.
wait for the bottle. right?
Yep.
So we want babies to get all the milk they need. We want them to be supplemented if they need to be. We don't want them to be supplemented if they don't need to be. And so if people
Absolutely.
can work with an IBCLC and really like come up with a plan that makes sense, and they can communicate to the pediatrician and everybody's assured that the baby is eating, but the parents aren't doing more than they have to be, and the babies aren't being overfed, which sometimes happens with a bottle too.
Absolutely.
It's
And all of
tricky.
this, it is, it is. And I think that brought up like two questions that I'd love to ask you about. One being like, absolutely, people thought that there was a nipple confusion situation. And I mean, sometimes that can happen, but in reality, like you said, we do know now that it's a lot more like flow confusion, which is why you'll hear a lot about paced bottle feeding and, you'll find IBCLCs and postpartum doulas and all of us, preaching that from the tops of the hills.
Right.
Um, but, is there a perfect sweet spot as to when to be offering bottles? And again, similar to the pumping, is there a pro or a con to doing so before, like earlier than that sweet spot or later?
Yeah. So just a plug, like we have this American idea that babies need to take bottles, which many babies do, but not
Right.
all babies, right? So it's like the first question is like, does your baby need to take a bottle, right?
Right.
But if the answer is yes, 3 to 4 weeks is often that Cinderella spot.
Okay.
And that's because hopefully it's given parents a chance to figure out breastfeeding and figure out parenting a little bit. It's a
Yep.
ever elusive goal, but start to feel like parents. It takes like 3 or 4 weeks to make a habit. So start to recover from childbirth, all those things. Babies initially are reflexive feeders. If you put your finger in a newborn's mouth, they have to suck, right? After the newborn period, they start to integrate those reflexes and they become voluntary feeders. So when parents wait, or sometimes they introduce a bottle at 3 or 4 weeks and then it's going great. So they stop doing it because it's more work to pump and give a bottle than it is to nurse, right?
Right.
So then they come back to it. I get a lot of calls, like literally people are going back to work on Monday and the baby
Yep.
now won't take a bottle. And the baby is a voluntary feeder. So the baby can choose. And sometimes the baby says, I choose no, and
Right.
we work with those babies. We can, mostly get them within a couple of consults to take a bottle, but it's not fun for anybody. It's
No.
much better
It's
to
very
introduce a
anxiety
bottle.
provoking.
I mean, and parents are like on the phone with work, like I'm actually not coming in on Monday, or that stuff is really stressful. So
Yeah,
um it's sort of blanket advice, and I already said like it's not one size
of
fits all.
course.
But in general, around 3 to 4 weeks is a good time to do it because babies had a chance to figure out body feeding and they haven't yet become a voluntary feeder.
I love that. I love that. And
Yeah.
that's typically what I've said to clients before because that's the information I was given. So I'm glad to know that
Yeah,
that's
yeah, I
that's
think
the
it's
good
right.
time frame.
Yeah.
And I love it because there is the idea that babies don't have to take a bottle is like mind-blowing information, I think, for probably 99% of the people listening right now.
Yeah.
Except for that 1% who may be one of my clients whose baby girl absolutely refused to take a bottle. And so all of a sudden she just started drinking out of a straw cup and
Yeah.
just she drank her milk out of a straw cup from day one in daycare because she refused to drink a single drop out of a bottle.
Right.
And so for some kids, that's just what they want, right?
I mean, it can work in a lot of different ways. So, I mean, my kids drank out of an open cup. They went right from the breast to an open cup. So
Yeah,
there's just a lot of possibilities. In the US, it's because I think our work leaves are so short. We're locked into this
right.
one model.
It's really it is a struggle and it's I think probably everyone can agree that we all wish it was longer, right?
Right.
Um but that like leads me to my other question that I had based off of like some information you had shared, which is, you said sometimes that topping off can be really hard or like I typically say the same thing with clients when I'm talking about like those dream feeds that sometimes people are offering before, they go to bed to like try to refill their bellies. Like sometimes
Yeah.
that can help, but like we also don't want to overfill babies, right? So we're really early on. People just had babies. Like, how do they know when their babies are truly full? What are they looking for, signs of an effective feed, an effective like milk withdrawal that baby is getting, right? And then showing that like what signs do we look for that we know they're done and we know they're fed and happy and like ideally gaining weight without having to, actually weigh them every 5 minutes.
Right, right. No, that's a great question. I think that's like the number one concern that parents have.
Right.
And I mean, we know that the main reason that people start to supplement before they want to is they are concerned that they don't have enough milk, whether that's true or
Absolutely.
not, right?
Right, right.
Because if you think the baby's not getting enough to eat, you can't think about anything else. Like we're wired for that. Like what else
Right.
does anything in the world matter if your baby's not getting enough to eat, right? So it's just
Exactly.
like feed the baby, feed the baby, feed the baby on repeat.
And then the stress makes your milk supply actually dip.
I'm it's like a catch 22. So
Yeah.
the questions I ask families are how many feeds in 24 hours? You don't have to log that forever, but until the baby's back to birth weight, we're paying a little bit of extra attention. So it is
Right.
good in those first, week or two until the baby's back at birth weight, how many feeds in 24 hours? I look for 10 plus feeds. You'll read 8 to 12, but when we do the math, babies need this much milk in 24 hours. This is the size of their stomach. Most of them need a minimum of 10 feeds in 24 hours. So that's the first thing. Is the baby eating 10 feed times a day, at least? Then whose idea are the feeds? It's totally fine to wake a baby up because it's been a long stretch, and that might be, more than 2 hours during the day, more than 3 hours at night. It's totally like what you were suggesting, like, you nurse the baby at 8 o'clock and now it's 9:30 and you're going to bed. I think that top off is totally reasonable. Let's reset the clock because if you go to bed at 9:30 and you haven't done that and the baby wakes up as you're drifting off, right? All right. So that's like a reasonable thing to me. You're going to the pediatrician, the baby doesn't know that, but you're like trying to schedule your morning, you try to fit an extra, all those things are reasonable. But we want to see the baby have the caloric energy on board to wake regularly to feed, and regularly is 10 times in 24 hours. It doesn't have to be evenly spaced every 2.5 hours, but we want that many feeds. That's the first
Right.
thing. Then we want the baby to come off when they're done with the feed. There are a lot of parents who ask the question that you just asked, Madison, which is like, when is the feed over? Because the baby never lets go. And that's the baby that's not truly satisfied,
Right.
right? So they come on, they do rapid sucking and they get a letdown. Oftentimes, when that letdown of milk ends, they'll go to sleep. They're like in a no man's land.
Yep.
They don't want to let go because they're not full, and they don't want to do the energy of more rapid sucking to get another letdown. They've like done the math, and the math is don't put out more energy. You're not going to get that much energy back in terms of
Right.
caloric energy, in terms of the milk. And then parents are like, I fed the baby for an hour and a half. Like you can't feed a baby for an hour. Like where would they put all that milk,
They
right?
have
But
no
like they've
energy.
been
Right.
there for an hour and a half. It feels like that. So in that case, we look to change the equation, make it easier for the baby. That's, probably deeper latch. It's skin to skin. It's the baby being in a good alignment, head over shoulder, shoulder over hip. It's the baby having good chin extension, really looking up at the breast. And often it's the baby doing the latch themselves in the laid back position. So often when the babies start the feed by latching themselves, they do the feed and then they complete the cycle by coming off.
That's great to hear. Yeah, I think that
Yeah,
that's so cool because I think people do think they're like, oh, well, my baby's lazy or my baby's just falling asleep or, my baby just wants to be on me and like wants to snuggle. And like, yes, some of that can be true, but if they're hungry too, we want to make sure that we're reading their cues properly and making sure they're getting that full feed in, right? Like, I mean, all for babies just wanting that skin to skin and totally go for that and get that, but at the same time, we don't want them to be like snacking the whole time, right? Because otherwise that can be really hard for them to get a full feed or for parents to get a break, right?
I mean, I think if they were actually snacking, it would be one thing, but
Right.
often they're not transferring at
Any
all,
milk, right? And
right?
people don't realize that, right? It's still a
Right.
new feeling that everyone has to kind of get used to. So trying to know what feels like what, I think can be
Yes.
really uh become like a black hole in new parents' minds of like, oh my gosh, I'm not feeding the baby enough and I don't know what this feels like and I don't know what that feels like. And it can really become like a weight on your shoulders. So it's good to hear like this is what you can look for. And I think that that's
Right.
really helpful for people.
Right. And seek help. Like, I mean, probably on a desert island, someone could like reinvent the wheel. But like the good news is you don't have to. There are
Right.
IBCLCs who can come to your house or, help you with telehealth, and you don't need to just sit and wonder, because that
Absolutely.
wonder can just eat away at you.
Yeah, and that kind of got me thinking. So I have plenty of clients that have asked this question, so I'd love your input.
Yeah.
You know, you said, "Oh, someone will say, "Oh, I fed my baby for an hour and a half." When we know that's really not true. So if people are timing their feeding sessions, how should they be timing it? Because a lot of clients will say, "Well, the second that they pop on, do I just start it and then when they absolutely fall asleep, I stop it?" Or every time that they pop off and look around or fall asleep and I have to wake them back up, should I be stopping and restarting it? Do we time these things? And is there a perfect amount of time that you should be feeding your baby for in a sitting?
Yeah, so there's a lot there. There isn't a perfect amount of time, because babies can transfer a lot of milk in a few minutes or little to no milk in, over an hour. It's
Right.
much more about what they're doing while they're there than
Okay.
how long the time is. It's hard. I know that in the hospital, the nurses have to chart the length of feeds, so they're asking families, and then people go home and they're using the apps, and the apps are
Yep.
asking. But I don't count that information at all. I'm interested in how many feeds in 24 hours. Are they the baby's idea? Does the baby come off when they're finished? If the parent is to feels like they have to wake the baby all the time, that's actually a red flag. Why is the baby so sleepy? It's hard. Why is it so hard? Let's make it easier so they
Yeah.
don't have to, struggle to stay awake, because they do that when they're not transferring easily, right?
Yeah. That's really good
So,
to know. And is that
yeah.
something that, I know when babies are really, really little, maybe they're born early or they're just a couple days early, they are definitely like super sleepy, like little beans, right?
Yeah.
So is that normal to see that you might have to try to keep your baby awake during a feed in those first few days and then they kind of start to become a little bit more awake during those feeds? Or are we looking for that kind of more alert feeding baby from the start?
So the reality is babies that are born earlier are more sleepy when they're feeding, and they're more sleepy in general, and they're also more likely to be jaundiced, which makes them
Right.
sleepy.
Yep.
They call babies that are born at like 37 and 38 weeks the great pretenders, right? So we used to be like, oh, your baby is 37 weeks, they're all done, right? And now we have this idea of preterm, but also early term. Like they look like term babies, but they're not quite there.
Yeah.
And so, I would really encourage anybody with a 37 or 38 weeker to be working with an IBCLC, because it is really helpful to get a care plan and make sure that those babies are getting enough to eat. And any baby
Absolutely.
who keeps it. I want to be clear. It's normal for babies to fall asleep at the breast because the breast is duct tape, right? So it fixes everything. But a baby that's falling asleep instead of transferring well is concerning.
Right.
So, like oftentimes we'll see babies wake up, they're hungry, they nurse. That means they come to the breast, they transfer milk, they come off, they're content. We see their little hands are open. A hungry baby will
Yep.
put their hands and fists by their face, and now their hands are low and open. But they might have a quiet alert period. You might change a diaper, and then they might be ready for napping, and they're again rooting and looking for the breast to go to sleep. So that's normal and fine.
Right.
But the baby that just shuts down constantly at the breast needs attention.
Absolutely. I love that you bring that up because I do. I think people are like, "Oh, well, they're just sleepy and like they're new and that's what they're supposed to do." And yes, newborn babies definitely are sleepy, but we also want to make sure that they're, effectively getting that milk and that full feed that they want.
Right.
And I love it too. Like getting a care plan from an IBCLC or lactation professional of some type can be so beneficial from the start, especially with, early babies. But even before you're having really any issues, right, is to kind of like line something up because then you know that if your goal is to breastfeed like exclusively or that to breastfeed at all, right? You know that you're getting the proper information from the start rather than having to like backtrack and try to fix something that you're struggling with.
Yeah, I totally agree. I mean, those are some of the most fun consults when there's not a problem. We're not fixing anything. It's just like tips and tricks and what to expect next week. And like,
Right.
just, like those are happy visits. And a lot of people find that they have complete reimbursement from their insurance. It's like, why
Yes.
wouldn't you have a personal trainer come to your house and,
Literally. Right, right. I
help you
think
make
people
sure you're doing the
often,
sit-ups the right way? I don't know. I'd have a
right.
personal trainer, whatever it is they do.
No, but exactly. I think people are always so afraid to like utilize that so early on because they're like, well, what if something happens and I should use them then? But But in reality, it's the fact that you're now creating a relationship with someone. You can make sure you trust them before they come in and can give you input. And you're getting tips and tricks from the start, which means that you're likely to not have as much of an issue down the line because you're given the proper information. So I
Yeah.
think that's huge.
I agree with that. And many people have like a minimum of 6 visits that are covered, which means you can have one prenatally and you can have several, near the beginning. And then you can have one when you're going back to work and you can have another one
Right.
when you're starting solids and a weaning one. And, like there's opportunity to do it multiple times.
There's so much support. I love that. And I guess like my one other question that I have for you is when people are nursing, what kind of tips and tricks do you have that they should be looking for, right? Like we know now how, positioning may really help. We know why babies may fall asleep on the boob and how they may look fully fed. But, what goes on in this process and like how do we actually do the actual breastfeeding? What should people be looking for to make sure their baby is getting a good feed?
Yeah, I mean, so like we're talking about myth busting, like it, I don't know, I want to like get a megaphone or something and just broadcast like it shouldn't hurt. It
Oh my
shouldn't
gosh,
hurt. It
right.
shouldn't hurt. It shouldn't hurt. It shouldn't hurt, right? Like I have a client I just saw who was like, yeah, it's a 4 when the baby latches. It's okay. I want to do the best thing for my baby. Like you can do the best thing for your baby and not be in pain 10 times a day.
Right.
Right? Like,
Right.
and the reality is that that painful latch is not the latch where the baby most easily transfers milk. So
Yeah.
it's not win-win for anyone.
Right. Right. I feel like
Um,
I so often hear in the world in like just the perinatal world, and I think it applies so well here. The like just because it's common doesn't mean that it's
right,
normal, right?
right,
Like yes, people are gonna say, "Oh, it hurts so much," and like just when they latch, it hurts, or "Oh, I have to wear these silverettes, or I have to use all this different nipple cream, or oh, I have to ice after because they're really sore, or I get these milk blebs, or whatever it may be." And
right.
yet that is common, but that doesn't mean it needs to be normal, right?
Those are all
So,
red flags, right?
yeah,
Like
yeah,
there's an easier way, like let's figure out what it is and do it because,
yeah,
it's a lot. You're doing it a lot of times a day to just be sitting with that. And it's
absolutely.
not a stable situation. Like it may get better. It can also get worse, right?
Right.
Unfortunately. So, figuring out ideally with an IBCLC how to get that deeper latch that's going to be both comfortable and have the baby be more easily able to transfer milk.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I think that's all such great information. And I think that, the real thing here that people should take away is just to find somebody and to talk to them, right? Because getting that information from somebody who knows you, your situation, your goals, and like what you're going through specifically, they can give you so much more, detailed information on what's good for you, you and your baby, right?
Right, exactly.
Yeah, awesome. Well,
Yeah.
thank you so much for joining me and for sharing all that information with everybody.
Hey, this was fun. Thank you for having me. Yeah.
Thank you so much for tuning into the Postpartum Plan podcast. I hope that today's episode brought you support, relatability, and valuable insight. Remember, you're not alone on this journey. If you enjoyed the show, please subscribe and leave a review and share with any of your prenatal and postpartum friends and family. Your feedback helps us reach more parents seeking support. And if you're looking for additional resources, please feel free to connect via Instagram at Serene Moments Doula for constant information, tips, and tricks, or check out my website, www.serenemomentsdoula.com. See you next week.